Hello everybody, welcome to another video from the RPA Vanguard channel. My name is Andy Menon. Today we are going to be taking a look at how to access the UiPath Data Service over APIs. A quick background, I had started to work with the data service feature of UiPath about a year ago, and one of my first projects was to build a workflow template that uses the data service feature. So this workflow template is listed here on my website, and if you click on the advanced automation template with data service link, it will take you directly to the marketplace. And if you go here, you will just get a brief overview on how this workflow template works with data service, and there is full documentation on how to create the entities that are required in your instance of UiPath Data Service. So long story short, what this workflow template does is it can store the automation configuration settings in the data service in addition to the config file that we are all normally used to working with. So that was my first experience with data service, but I also wanted to explore the APIs, but I could not get a chance until recently. I started revisiting data service after DevCon, and I wanted to take a crack at it. And in this demonstration video, I'm going to be showing you how to work with the UiPath data service over APIs. I'm in the UiPath data service in my instance of the automation cloud. And what you're looking at here is a simple entity named user profile. I have created this entity with 4 columns. This has been created for the purposes of demonstrating API access in this video. And what I have done as a starting point is I have created about 3 records. The idea behind this setup is that once we are able to access this entity over APIs, we should be able to read this information using an API client such as Postman. So I'm going to assume that the audience are familiar with the basics of data service, at least to the point where you can create a basic entity and populate it with some information. With that, I'm going to switch over to the documentation for API access, and we'll take a look at how we can get started with API access to this instance of the data service. So once the data service has been created and you have data in your entities, the next step would be for us to register an external application. Now, any API client that's going to access data service must be recognized as an external client. And that will be the first step that we are going to be performing in the automation cloud. So if you click on this link, it will take you to this screen here. It's titled Managing External Applications, and there is full documentation on how to register an external client. But I must also point out that there are a few disconnects, and you may run into some kind of confusion or run into trouble to complete this process. And I'm going to soon show you why. So what I will be demonstrating will be these steps from point 1 all the way down to point 10 here. And along the way, I'm going to show you what the disconnects are. So with that, let me hop back to the instance of my automation cloud. And I'm going to go back to admin. Then we switch to external clients. And I'm going to now begin the process of adding an application. So for the purposes of this demo, I'm going to just name this application as Demo Volante. and I'm going to mark this application as non-confidential. Now, if we go into the documentation, a confidential application is one that can store a client secret key securely and then use that client secret key to access the data service in a safe and secure manner. If your application does not have that capability, then you will have to mark your application as non-confidential. And the protocol to uh, and the protocol that the non-confidential application uses to authorize itself before it can access the API is different. It uses something called PKCE or PKCE. So in this demo, I will be showing you how to authorize yourself using PKCE. The next step for us is to add the scope. So I click on Add Scopes, and then because we are going to be accessing the data service resource, we'll have to select Data Service API. And then the Data Service API has got three kinds of scope. One is the ability to read the schema. The second is to read the data. And the third is to write to that entity. So which means basically you should be able to read, write, and also read the structure of your entity. Now, based on the functionality of your application, you can add one or more scopes to this list. So for the purposes of this demo, I'm going to be a bit liberal here, and I'm going to be adding all three of them. So when I click Save, I'm going to have my scope listed here. And what I'll be doing is I'm going to copy this because we'll need this later. And I'm going to store that here in my notepad document. So I'm going to say non-confidential app scope. So I have that. The next step is where you will be running into some confusion, and and that has to do with the redirect URL. So if you go back to the documentation page on registering the external application and look for redirect, there is only one mention of the redirect URL on this entire page. So if you read bullet number 9, it makes it look like that the redirect URL is optional, but it is not optional. There are two reasons for it, and we are going to talk about the first reason. The first reason is the redirect URL is a required column in your application registration process. So if you do not put in anything here, right, it's not going to allow you to save. And here you go. I tried to save it, but you can see that this field is required, right? And that's the first problem. So if you go back to the documentation again and take a look at this, you will see that this doesn't hold true. And I have brought this up with UiPath, and I have also requested them to have this documentation updated. So this is the first reason. You will need to know what your redirect URL is. Now, in this case, the redirect URL is going to be the one that is published by Postman because I'll be using the Postman client. So there is a UiPath connector documentation for Postman, and I will link that documentation in the video description. And if you go to this page, it will show you what are the callback URLs that you can use. Now I'm using the desktop version of Postman client, so I will be using this callback URL. I'm going to copy this and I'm going to go back to my application registration page, and I'm going to put that in here. And now that I have the redirect URL, I must be able to complete the application registration process. So I'm going to click add. and my application registration is complete. So please save this application ID as part of your notes. So the next thing I'm going to be documenting here in my notes is the app ID. So good, we have the scope and we also have the application ID. Okay, so now we have completed the registration process for the non-confidential application. The next step for us is to understand what is the authorization protocol that we'll need to use for this non-confidential application to access the data service over an API call. For that, I'll go back to the documentation. And so far, we have completed these steps from point 1 through point 10 to register the application. So if you scroll down this page, you will see another link uh, that says accessing UiPath resources using external applications. If you click on this link, it will take you to this page. So if you look at this page, the first section says grant types, and you will have to give a different type of grant based on the kind of application you have registered. Now, we have registered the non-confidential application, and the only type of grant that is available to this application is called authorization code with PKCE. And PKCE, there is a separate page that talks about this protocol. And you can go to this page that is linked in this documentation. So if we go down here, there is an RFC specification to understand what authorization code with PKCE means. So if you click on this RFC code, it's going to take you to this RFC specification. So you can go through this page in leisure, but PKCE stands for uh, Proof Key for Code Exchange, or PKCE. It's pronounced PKCE, and there is a schematic here that shows how this PKCE protocol operates. And you will see that on the left is the client, and on the right, there are two endpoints. One is the authorization endpoint, and the other is the token endpoint. And the whole client server interaction hinges on a premise of a code challenge and a code verifier. And you can read this in detail. Now, a client such as Postman will generate its own code challenge. Whereas if you want to write something on your own, you will have to generate the code challenge and the code verifier yourself. And you can do that by going to a site such as this one. I'll link this in the description below, but I personally haven't tried working with this site and generating my own code challenge and code verifier, but you can generate your own and try to use it in your client applications. But something like Postman, it will do the job of generating this code challenge by itself. So that is that's a short summary of the authorization code with PKCE protocol. So we'll be using that in Postman. So I'm going to be switching to Postman, and this is my Postman environment. I've already created a separate environment that indicates what I'll be doing with this collection of APIs. And just for the purposes of documentation, I've added a variable that indicates to me for future purposes what the instance of data service that these API calls are going to be going to. So in this case, the tenant name is RPA Vanguard Support Service. So I have put in that name here for documentation. Otherwise, this is not going to be used for any other purpose. The next step for us is going to be to compose the authorization request. Now, to do that, we will need a few things. So if I go back to that RFC specification, you see that there are a couple of endpoints here. One is the authorization endpoint, and the other is the token endpoint. So from the documentation, you will get the links to these two endpoints, and I'm going to, I've already put it in the notes, and you can see that the first authorization URL is the authorized link, and the second endpoint is known as the token link. So we have this handy. And the third item that you will need, which is very important, and that is the callback URL. And we did discuss earlier during the beginning of this video about that confusion with the redirect URL. So for that, I'm going to show you something in Postman that reinforces why we need this callback URL and why it's important. So I already have a collection made out here in Postman. So I'm going to add a request to it. So we will be composing the authorization request. So I am going to click on the authorization tab. And here I'm going to be selecting OAuth 2, because this is the authorization type that we need to select. And you can leave this particular attribute default. And if you go over to the right, you will see many number of inputs that the OAuth 2 authorization request will require. One of the first items is the callback URL, and that is the redirect URL that I was talking about. Now, if you hover on this help icon, it's difficult to read here. So what I have done is I have pulled that into a screen grab. And if you look at this, the help indicates very clearly that the callback URL that you specify here must match the one that you used during your application registration process. So you can see why this is important. And this has not been made very clear in the UiPath documentation that shows the steps for you to register your application. And therefore, you need to make sure you have the URL that matches exactly with the URL that you used during your application registration process. So we already have that here because this has been published by Postman. And so we are also adding that to our notes. Now, with this, what we are going to be doing is we are going to be composing the authorization request. So I'm going to switch back to Postman. One of the things with Postman is that if you have composed something in the past, it's going to populate those columns for you, which is the case in my environment. I have done this before, so it has already populated some of the things, but I'm going to go through them nonetheless. The first item is the grant type. So the grant type is authorization code with PKCE. So once you select this, you will have all these attributes opening up for you to populate. So the first one is the callback URL. And you can see that it is the same here. So I'm going to just take this and I'm going to populate that here. The next thing will be our authorization URL. We also have that, and that is the authorize link that we have in our notes. I'm going to delete this and put this one in. And the next one is the access token URL. Again, straightforward. And this is important. The client ID is something that you got when you registered your application. And we're going to take that, delete this because this client ID doesn't exist anymore. So I'm going to put in a new one. And this must be set to SHA 256. This is mandatory, so you need to set this to SHA 256. It's already set, so I'm not going to change that. The next item on the list is scope. And again, we do have the scope, and I'm going to paste that in here. And then one of the things that you have to note here is that You do not have to put anything in the request URL. So what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be saving this. And with that, I have completed the composition of the authorization request. Now, do not get confused and hit send, because you are not sending a URL request. You are actually sending an authorization request. So what you will have to do next is to click on the Get New Access token. I'm here at the redirect URL, and it is asking me to log in to my data service instance. So I'll have to log in to the same automation cloud that contains the data service entities and also the registered application. So I'm going to now continue to log in with my email. And now my authorization request is complete and the access token is being returned by the token endpoint. So I'm going to click on proceed. So I have got the token back from the token endpoint. And what I'm going to be doing is just modify this and change the name of the token. And I'm going to say RPAVG support token. And I'm going to click use token. And as soon as I do that, this particular field that was empty previously gets populated with the token. So now we have successfully authorized ourselves against the token endpoint and got our token. But here's the catch. This token expires within the hour. So if you have to use it to perform any of your data service entity requests, you will have to do it within the hour. And let's go take a look at the token quickly. So if I go to manage tokens, I have this token here. And if you scroll down, notice that this is a one-time token. I will tell you why this is, but if you look at this now, it says that this token is of type bearer, which means that I have to use these tokens in my subsequent request. The second thing is it expires in an hour, and you also see the scope that was input to the request when we submitted the authorization request to get the token. So please note these three attributes, because we'll be talking about something called refresh tokens later, and you will see the difference between a one-time token such as this one and a refresh token later. So within the next hour before that token expires, we must use it to read the data from our entity in the data service. So for that, I'm here on this documentation page. It says get entity records. And what we'll be doing is the URL to establish the get request will be a combination of the base URL, which you see here, and also the URL extension that follows the base URL. So what I have done is I've actually copied these two pieces back to my notepad. And if you look at it, the URL is the base followed by the entity that you want to read. So in my case, it's going to translate into this URL here. And if you observe, the user profile that I have is the name of the entity that I have in my data service instance. And the name is user profile. So I have composed the full URL that I require. So what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be using this URL to place the GET request. Then there are other optional parameters that you can submit as part of the request. One is the start position, meaning the record number from where you want the read operation to begin. By default, this is 0, which means that the records will be read from the first entity in the list. And then you can limit the number of records that you want to read. I think the default maximum limit is 500. Um, Otherwise, you can set it to a small limit. The next is the expansion level. If your entity is complex and it has multiple relations at different levels, then you might have to set this to a specific number. By default, this is going to be 2. You can set it to 1, and I think the maximum level is 3. So we have all the pieces that we require in addition to the token that we generated. So we'll use this and compose our GET request. So for that, I'm going to go back to my Postman environment, and under my collection, I've already started a new request. And this time, your authorization type will be bearer token. And where am I going to get this bearer token from? If I go back to the previous authorization request, and if I go to this column, this field, sorry, here is the token. And just because this is a demonstration, I am hard coding everything, but this is not a good practice. In the real world, you will be saving this token as a variable and then using it in subsequent requests. But in this case, I'm going to simply copy the entire token. Um, and I will be using it in this request. So here I have selected bearer token, and I am going to paste the very long token here. So now I have the token. The next item on the list will be the parameters. So I'm going to add start. Uh, these are optional, but I'm doing this for the purposes of this video so that we are aware that these options exist. So limit, I'm going to just say 10. And I'm going to copy paste the next one because I'm not very sure about the case. It's expansion level. In this case, it really does not matter because we have a single level entity, but I'm going to still keep it at 2. So here you can see that the URL is not composed very well, and that is because we have not given it the complete URL. It has simply composed the attributes. So what I'm going to be doing is going back to my notepad, and I'm going to copy this entire URL and paste it here. So now I have composed the complete request, and I'm going to save the request. And now I'm going to hit send. I'm going to make sure that my console is clear of all previous errors. So clear, my response is clear, and I'm going to be hitting send. And we have success. So we have a 200 OK success. And I'm going to close out this console. If we bring up the response window, if I push this up a little bit. So we have the first successful read request to our data service endpoint. And you can see that there are 3 records. And these are the 3 records that we set up at the beginning of this video. So in this case, because we have set the limit to 10 records, all three records have been returned. And these are the records. If we go back and clarify, these are the very same three records that we set up here in our data service before we started our API testing. Now, I'm going to slightly change this for the purposes of running another test. What I'll be doing is I'm going to change the limit on this request to just one record. And I'm going to save this request and I'm going to hit send again. And here you can see that this can be a little bit misleading. It does tell you that the total number of record count is 3. We'll have to verify this because we applied a limit of 1 and it did return just one record, but it does show that 3 records have been returned. So I'm not very sure how this API works. It should actually be 1. And this can cause problems if we are doing any kind of validation based on the number of records returned. Otherwise, it should not be a big problem. But this is something that we need to verify. So that's pretty much it for part 1 of this video series. In the next video, we are going to be talking about how to fetch a refresh token and then use that refresh token to get new access tokens if we write a full-fledged API application. And we'll take a look at how to do that in part 2 of this video series. Thank you for watching this video, and if you like it, please like and subscribe to my channel, and I'll talk to you soon. Thank you.